They told us it could not be passed. That was the first lie. Not a deliberate one, no, the coalition does not deal in falsehoods so crude, but a quieter deception, the kind born from certainty, from centuries of data, from thousands of species catalogued, measured, perfected, and ultimately limited. I was there when the test was unveiled. We stood within the observation halo, suspended above the proving chamber like distant gods, our forms illuminated by the cold lattice of instrumentation grids. Below us, the chamber stretched into engineered infinity, modular terrain shifting in silent preparation, atmospheric regulators humming with lethal precision, gravity anchors primed to rewrite the very meaning of weight. "It is elegant," Instructor Selnari had said, her voice layered with harmonic pride. Elegant. That was one word for it. The test was not designed to be survived. It was designed to define the exact moment survival became impossible. A perfect boundary, a flawless equation. Every species that entered it had answered the same question: where do you break? And every time, the test had answered back, with absolute certainty. Until the humans. They arrived without ceremony. No biological spectacle, no adaptive grandeur, no visible superiority. Their form was inefficient, soft tissue exposed beneath fragile dermal layers, internal structure rigid, prone to fracture, a single respiratory system, vulnerable to disruption, a heart that could fail under stress thresholds most species consider trivial. I remember reviewing their file. Resilient, it stated. Nothing more. No specialized traits, no evolutionary advantages worth annotation. Just that one word, buried beneath pages of mediocrity. Resilient. I dismissed it. We all did. The human stood alone at the chamber's threshold. No exosuit, no augmentation, no environmental adaptation. Just a thin layer of protective fabric, and a stillness that, at the time, I misinterpreted as ignorance. I initiated the pre-test protocol. Subject designation, human. The chamber responded instantly. Gravity field stabilized at baseline. Atmospheric composition aligned with the human's native environment. Terrain locked into its initial configuration, a flat expanse designed to give the illusion of fairness. It was not fair. It had never been fair. How long? I asked, more out of procedural obligation than genuine concern. The human looked up. Not at the chamber. At us. At me. There was no fear in its expression, no awe, no visible comprehension of what stood before it. Just focus. Then it spoke. How long is this? The question was incorrect. Subjects usually asked about survival parameters, about safety thresholds, about the conditions under which the test would be terminated. Not duration. Duration implied expectation. You will cease when failure occurs, I replied. A standard answer. A sufficient answer. But the human did not look satisfied.
It nodded once, as if filing the information away, then stepped forward into the chamber without another word. No hesitation, no negotiation. That was the moment something shifted. I did not understand it then. I only recognized it as a disruption, a subtle deviation from the countless evaluations I had overseen before. I signaled the start. The world below us changed. Gravity increased in a controlled surge, rising steadily beyond the tolerance of most bipedal species. The terrain fractured into uneven segments, forcing constant recalibration of balance. Atmospheric density fluctuated, introducing resistance with every movement, every breath. The human staggered. Of course it did. Its frame was not built for such stress. Its muscles strained immediately, micro-tremors visible even through the chamber's distortion fields. Its steps became heavy, uneven, predictable. I turned my attention to the biometric display, expecting the usual cascade of failure indicators. Heart rate spike, muscular overload, skeletal stress nearing critical thresholds, all within acceptable projections. Selnari asked beside me. Within standard deviation, I replied. Another routine evaluation, another inevitable conclusion. Below us, the human took another step, and another. Slow, inefficient, unremarkable, yet continuous. Minutes passed. That was the first anomaly. Most subjects failed within seconds under initial gravity escalation. The human did not. Its movement degraded, yes, but it did not stop. I adjusted the sensor resolution. Enhance biological telemetry, I instructed. The data sharpened. And then, something was wrong. Impossible, whispered Selneri. I did not respond. I was already analyzing. Muscle fibers were tearing. That was expected. But they were also stabilizing. Not repairing, not at this stage, but compensating, redistributing strain in ways that did not align with optimized biological responses. The skeletal structure showed early-stage microfractures. Also expected. But the fractures were not propagating as predicted. The human was altering its posture subtly, inefficiently, reducing stress concentrations through continuous, imperfect adjustment. It was not avoiding damage. It was managing it. That is not viable, Selneri said. No, I agreed. It wasn't. And yet, the human kept moving. I increased gravity. Not beyond protocol, not yet, but enough to accelerate the inevitable. The chamber responded. Weight intensified. The human's body reacted violently, knees buckling, spine compressing under the load. It dropped to one limb. There. That was the breaking point. I marked the timestamp, preparing to log the failure. The human remained still for a moment. Its head lowered. Its breathing became erratic, visible even from our distant vantage point. Then, it moved again. Not upward. Forward. Dragging itself across the fractured terrain with a motion that defied classification. Not efficient, not sustainable, not logical.
But undeniably intentional. The room grew quiet. I became aware, distantly, that no one was speaking. All attention had narrowed to a single point below us. The human's vitals surged past projected limits. Pain indicators exceeded measurable thresholds. Oxygen intake dropped as atmospheric density shifted unpredictably. Every system we tracked was signaling the same conclusion. Failure was not imminent. It had already occurred. And yet, the subject did not stop. I felt it then. Not uncertainty, something deeper. A fracture, not in the test, not yet, but in our understanding of it. This is a sensor error, Selneri said, though her voice lacked conviction. I did not answer, because I was watching the human. And for the first time since the Coalition began recording such things, I did not know what would happen next. The test was designed to find the limit, but as the human dragged itself forward, leaving behind the invisible threshold it had already crossed, a new question began to form. Not where it would break, but if it would. And as Phase 1 continued to escalate beyond every previous failure point, I realized with a clarity that unsettled something fundamental within me. The test was no longer measuring the human. It was waiting for it to stop. And it wasn't. It should have ended there. By every model we had ever constructed, by every data set gathered across centuries of observation, the human had already crossed the point of failure. And yet it moved. Not well, not efficiently, not in any way that could be mistaken for control. But it moved. Increase gravitational load, I ordered, my voice quieter than I intended. No one questioned it. The chamber responded instantly. Gravity surged. Not gradually this time, but in a sharp, punishing escalation designed to collapse even reinforced skeletal matrices. The kind of force that had once driven a 9-limbed war species into the ground so completely that their exoskeletons had splintered inward. I remember that test. It lasted 3 seconds. Below us, the human's body reacted with violent immediacy. Its spine compressed visibly, curvature distorting under the sudden load. Knees buckled. One limb failed entirely, collapsing beneath it as the terrain shifted unpredictably. A sound reached us through the audio filters. A sharp internal crack. Selneri flinched. Yes, I said. This was expected. Long overdue, in fact. Fractures propagated along the human skeletal frame, micro at first, then expanding in jagged patterns across stress-bearing regions. The data streamed across my interface in precise, clinical detail. Catastrophic. Irreversible. Terminal. The human did not fall. It paused, just for a moment, as if the command to collapse had been issued, and then denied. Slowly, with movements that bordered on mechanical failure, it adjusted. Its posture shifted, not into any optimal configuration we recognized, but into something improvised. We had redistributed unevenly across damaged limbs.
Its center of gravity lowered, not by design, but necessity. And then, it took another step. Selnari's instruments flickered. No, I agreed again. The word was becoming meaningless. Recalibrate all sensors, she said sharply. Full spectrum diagnostics. Her certainty was unraveling. I did not stop her. If this was an error, I wanted it identified. If it was not. The recalibration completed in less than a breath cycle. The data returned. Unchanged. If anything, worse. Muscle fibers across the human's body were undergoing rapid degradation, tears layered upon tears, structural integrity failing faster than it could be maintained. But there was something else, something we had not seen before. Pause, I said. The display froze. Selnari hesitated only a fraction before complying. The magnification deepened. And there it was. Repair. Not complete, not efficient, but undeniable. At the microscopic level, the human's body was attempting to rebuild itself even as it was being destroyed. Protein structures reformed under stress, cellular activity spiking in chaotic, unsustainable bursts. It was not healing. It was resisting. Impossible, Selnari repeated, but this time the word fractured. The rate of degradation exceeds the rate of repair, I said. It is, she replied. We both looked back to the chamber. The human dragged itself forward another fraction of a distance. It is collapsing, she whispered. I did not answer, because I was beginning to understand something far more unsettling than a sensor malfunction. Advance to atmospheric phase, I said. There was a pause. Not from the system. From the room. Another instructor asked, their voice edged with something I had not heard before, hesitation. The subject has not failed, I replied. The words felt different now, less certain, more like a challenge. The chamber obeyed. Atmospheric composition destabilized instantly, oxygen levels plummeted, replaced by inert gases designed to induce rapid hypoxia. Pressure fluctuated in tandem, disorienting respiratory cycles and disrupting equilibrium. In every recorded instance, this phase ended within seconds. Neural shutdown. Motor failure. Termination. The human inhaled. And nothing happened. No. Worse than nothing. Its body reacted as expected. Chest expansion slowed. Oxygen intake dropped to near zero. Blood oxygen saturation levels fell with alarming speed. Its movements faltered. Steps became uneven, uncoordinated. Its vision, tracked through ocular micromovements, began to blur, focus drifting erratically across the terrain. Yes, Selnari said, relief breaking through. She believed it. I wanted to. The human stumbled. Its body swayed under the combined assault of gravity and oxygen deprivation. One step misaligned, then another. It fell. The impact was heavy, final. For a moment, just a moment, the universe corrected itself. This concludes, Selnari began. The human's fingers moved. The statement died in her throat. I leaned forward, my attention narrowing to a single, impossible detail. The human did not rise. It should not have. Instead, it began to crawl. There was no efficiency in the motion, no coordinated pattern that could be analyzed or replicated. Limbs dragged unevenly, muscles failing mid-action, coordination breaking apart under neurological strain. But the direction remained consistent. Forward. Neural function should be degrading, Selnari said, her voice thin. Correct, I said. I watched the human pull itself across the terrain, leaving behind faint traces of damage no sensor could fully quantify. Not blood, not simply biological failure. Something else. I do not know, I admitted. And that was the moment the test began to change. Not in its structure, not in its parameters, but in what it revealed. We had designed the evaluation to measure capability, strength, endurance, adaptability, quantifiable metrics, predictable outcomes. The human did not fit within those parameters. It was no longer functioning within measurable capability. Its body had already failed. Its systems were collapsing in real time. And yet, it continued. Not because it could, but because it did. That is not survival, Selnari said softly. No, I replied. Below us, the human's movement slowed further. Each action became smaller, weaker, more fragmented than the last. And still, forward. The terrain shifted again, introducing incline, a subtle change, insignificant under normal conditions. Now, it might as well have been a vertical ascent. The human paused at its base. For a moment, I thought, this is it. This is where it ends. Its head lowered, its body stilled. Every measurable function hovered at the edge of termination. Then, with a motion so slight it almost escaped detection, it began to climb. The room was silent. Not the silence of routine observation. The silence of something breaking. Not the human. Us. Terminate the phase, one instructor said suddenly. No, I said. The word came faster than thought, sharper than intended. The statement echoed in the chamber. No one argued, because no one could define what failure looked like anymore. Time lost meaning after that. The phase continued far beyond its intended duration. Metrics exceeded their maximum recording thresholds. Systems began to flag errors, not because they were malfunctioning, but because they had no framework for what they were observing. And still, the human moved. By the time Phase 1 reached its conclusion, there was no signal, no definitive endpoint, no clear moment where success or failure could be declared. The system simply stopped escalating, as if it too had reached a limit. The human collapsed at the crest of the incline, completely still. For several long moments, no one spoke. Is it? Selnari finally asked. I checked the readings. They flickered, stabilized, then resolved into something that should not have existed. Alive, I said. The word felt insufficient.
Below us, the human did not rise. It did not celebrate. It did not acknowledge what it had done. It simply remained, existing at the edge of impossibility. I looked at the final metrics of the phase. There was no classification, no category, no outcome. For the first time since the test was created, there was no answer. And as I stared down at the human, broken, unmoving, yet undeniably present, I understood something that unsettled the very foundation of everything we believed. The test had not been passed, but it had not been failed, and that meant we had never truly understood what it was measuring, or what the human was. We should have stopped the test. That realization came too late to matter. The chamber had already begun its next sequence. The announcement echoed with clinical indifference, as if what followed was no different from any prior evaluation, as if we were still in control of what this test meant. We were not. Below us, the human remained where it had collapsed, motionless, fractured, barely sustaining the minimum parameters of life. Its biological systems flickered at the edge of systemic failure. Under any known standard, it should have been removed,
stabilized, declared incapable of continuation. Instead, we continued. The pain fields activated. At first, there was no visible change. Pain, as most species understand it, requires interpretation. Neural pathways must receive, process, and respond. It is a system of signals, not an immediate force. But the fields we had engineered bypassed that process. They did not signal pain. They imposed it. Every nerve in the human's body ignited simultaneously. The reaction was instantaneous. The human screamed. It was not a controlled vocalization, not a measured response. It was raw, unfiltered, a sound torn from the deepest layers of biological distress. Its body arched violently, muscles contracting beyond functional limits as electrical chaos surged through its nervous system. Heart rate spiked, then spiked again, then exceeded the upper bounds of our monitoring systems entirely. "This will terminate neural function," Selnari said, her voice tight. She was correct. She had always been correct. Until now. The human's body convulsed against the chamber floor, limbs striking the fractured terrain with uncontrolled force. Muscular coordination disintegrated under the overload. Every system we tracked was cascading toward collapse. And yet, it did not stop. The screaming continued. But beneath it, beneath the chaos, something else emerged. Movement. At first, it was indistinguishable from involuntary reaction, random spasms, misfired signals. Then it repeated. A pattern. Small, inconsistent, but present. "Pause the visual feed," I said. Selnari hesitated. The chamber display froze, capturing the human mid-convulsion. "Overlay motion tracking," I continued. Data layered over the image, vectors, trajectories, predictive modeling. For a moment, nothing aligned. Then, the pattern resolved.
"No," said Laurie whispered. The movements were not random.
If anything, the suffering had intensified beyond comprehension. But it was no longer chaotic. It had become structured, purposeful. "They're not resisting the pain," Selnari said softly. I did not respond immediately, because the realization had already taken hold. The words settled over the observation deck like a weight heavier than any gravity field. No one spoke, because we all understood what that meant. Pain, in every known species, is a limiting factor, a signal to stop, a boundary enforced by biology itself. The human had redefined it, converted it, weaponized it. By the midpoint of Phase 2, the human's body was failing in ways we could no longer fully quantify. Energy reserves depleted beyond recovery thresholds, tissue integrity compromised across all major systems, neural pathways operating under sustained overload. Every measurable parameter indicated the same conclusion. Termination was inevitable. And yet, the human accelerated. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be mistaken for strength, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to challenge everything we believed. That is where it ends, one instructor said, though their voice trembled. No one agreed. No one disagreed. Because no one knew. The test continued to escalate, pushing the human further into states of existence we had never recorded. And still, it moved. I felt it then. Not uncertainty, not confusion. Something colder, something sharper. Fear. Because the test had been designed with a fundamental assumption that every species had a limit, a point beyond which continuation was impossible. We had built our entire understanding of strength around that assumption. The human was dismantling it, piece by piece. Below us, the chamber shifted again, preparing for the next escalation. The human did not slow. It did not hesitate. It did not acknowledge the transition. It simply continued. And as I watched it move through pain that should have ended its existence, I realized something that no data could quantify. We were not observing the limits of a species. We were observing the absence of them. And that was far more dangerous than anything the test had ever been designed to measure. Because if pain could not stop them, then what could? We were not meant to enter the test. That truth had always existed, unspoken, but understood. The instructors of the coalition did not participate. We designed, we calibrated, we observed.
Our role was to define limits, not to be bound by them. The test was beneath us. Or so we believed. Phase 3 requires calibration, Salnari said, her voice carefully controlled, as if precision alone could restore order to what we were witnessing. It was protocol. It had always been protocol. Before escalation beyond defined thresholds, an instructor simulation was required. A verification process. A guarantee that the parameters remained within the realm of measurable possibility. In every prior instance, the simulation had been brief, symbolic. We entered the system, confirmed its function, and withdrew long before failure approached. There was no need to continue further. The limits were already known. But now we did not know. And that uncertainty demanded validation. I will initiate the simulation, I said. The words left my mouth before I fully understood why. Salnari turned toward me sharply. It is required, I replied. Even to my own perception, the statement felt like justification rather than truth. Below us, the human moved. Slowly. Brokenly. But still. Forward. We need a baseline, I continued. Salnari hesitated. For the first time since I had known her, she did not have an immediate answer. The chamber responded to my authorization. A secondary field activated, parallel to the primary test environment. Identical in structure, identical in parameters, a perfect mirror. Except this time, the subject would be me. Transition was instantaneous. One moment I stood within the observation halo, suspended in detached superiority. The next, I was inside the test. The first sensation was gravity. It struck without warning, compressing my frame with a force I had only ever observed from a distance. My species was engineered for strength, dense musculature, reinforced skeletal architecture, optimized for high-pressure environments. It did not matter. The weight drove me downward, joints locking under the sudden load. My posture destabilized instantly, balance compromised by terrain that shifted beneath my limbs without pattern or logic. This is within expected parameters, I said, though my voice strained against the pressure. I attempted to take a step. My body resisted. Muscles engaged, correctly, efficiently, but the force required to overcome the gravitational variance exceeded my projected output. I adjusted. Recalibrated stance. Attempted again. The result was marginally better. But not enough. Pain registered. At first it was distant, a secondary signal, something to be acknowledged, then dismissed. Then the neural fields activated. The transition was instantaneous. Agony flooded my system, bypassing all natural gating processes. My thoughts fractured under the sudden influx of sensory overload, every nerve ignited in perfect synchronized torment. I staggered. Not from the gravity. From the pain. Maintain control, Salnari's voice echoed faintly through the simulation link. I tried. I truly did. But the pain was not something to control. It was something to endure. And I had never needed to endure it before. My species evolved to minimize suffering, to optimize function, to eliminate inefficiency. Pain was a warning, not a constant, a signal to adjust, not a force to overcome. This was something else. I attempted another step. My limbs responded too slowly. Neural pathways lagged, overloaded by the competing demands of movement and survival. Coordination faltered. I fell. The impact was immediate, jarring, and, unexpectedly, final. For a moment, I did not move. I could not. The weight of the chamber pressed me into the terrain, while the pain fields tore through my nervous system without pause, without rhythm, without mercy. This is sufficient, Salnari said quickly. I heard her. I understood the command. But something within me resisted. Not instinct. Not training. Something else. I forced my limbs to respond. They did not. The signal reached them, of that I was certain, but the response was delayed, fragmented, incomplete. Another attempt. Another failure. My body was no longer operating within predictable parameters. This is, I began. The sentence did not finish. Because in that moment, I understood. This was the limit. Not theoretical. Not projected. Real. I had reached it in less than a fraction of the time that human had endured. And simulation, I said. The command came without resistance. Without hesitation. Because there was nothing left to prove. The world shifted. Gravity released. Pain vanished. I was back in the observation halo. But something had changed. Not in the chamber. In me. I looked down. The human was still moving. The realization struck harder than any force within the test. I lasted, I began. Selnari completed the thought for me. 96. The number hung between us. Precise. Unforgiving. Insignificant. I was operating at optimal capacity, I said. Selnari did not respond. Because there was nothing to say. Another instructor stepped forward. Their species was superior to mine in several measurable ways. Greater neural redundancy. Enhanced pain tolerance. More adaptable physiology. They entered the chamber. They lasted longer. Not much. Another followed. Then another. Each attempt ended the same way. Rapid degradation. Loss of control. Termination. Some lasted seconds longer. Some failed faster. None came close. From the observation halo, the pattern became undeniable. We were not measuring superiority. We were measuring something we did not possess. The room began to change. Not physically, but perceptually. Where there had once been confidence, there was now tension. Where there had been certainty, there was doubt. And beneath it all, something far more dangerous. Respect. No species has ever exceeded instructor thresholds. One of us said quietly. They have now. Selnari replied. Below us, the human collapsed again.
Its body struck the terrain with a force that should have ended all remaining function. Its limbs lay at unnatural angles. Its breathing, if it could still be called that, was irregular, shallow, barely sustained. For a moment, it did not move. This is the end, someone said. But no one believed it, because we had said that before, too many times. The human's fingers twitched, a small motion, insignificant, except that it wasn't. It dragged itself forward again, not because it had recovered, not because it had adapted, but because it had chosen to continue. I felt something fracture then, not in the test, not in the human, in us. The parameters, Selnari began, then stopped. She could not finish the thought, because the parameters no longer mattered. We had designed the test to define the limits of others. Now it was defining ours, and we were failing, spectacularly. I cannot replicate this, one instructor said. The admissions came one by one, quiet, measured, final, because there was no argument left to make. We were not the standard. We were not the measure. We were not even participants. We were observers, watching something we could not achieve. Below us, the human continued, barely conscious, physically destroyed, neurologically unstable, and still moving. The test no longer represented superiority. It exposed difference, a fundamental divide between what we were and what they were. We designed perfection, I said slowly. Selnari looked at me. Her silence was answer enough. I looked back to the chamber, to the human, to the impossible, relentless motion that refused to cease. They do not operate within those limits, I said. No, Selnari agreed. The word felt heavier now, because it carried implication, consequence, fear. We were no longer evaluating a subject.
We were witnessing something else, something that could not be categorized, could not be replicated, could not be understood. And as the human dragged itself forward, again and again and again, I realized the most unsettling truth of all. The test had never been designed for them, because if it had been, we would have known. And we did not, which meant, whatever this was, we were seeing it for the first time, and we had no idea where it would end. There is a moment in every system, a point we have always believed to be absolute, the breaking point. It is not theoretical, it is not philosophical. It is engineered into every evaluation, every simulation, every test ever constructed by the Coalition. It is the point where complexity collapses into simplicity, where resistance becomes surrender, where continuation becomes impossible. We had built entire doctrines around it. We had measured it across species, across civilizations, across forms of life that thought themselves unbreakable. And they all broke. Eventually. Always. But the human reached that point and did not stop. I remember the exact moment the readings changed. Not gradually, not predictably,
but violently. Vital systems destabilizing, Selnari said, her voice unusually tight. On the display, the human's biological metrics collapsed in real time. Heart rate, erratic. Respiration, failing. Neural activity, fragmenting into disorganized spikes. Then, flatline. A clean, definitive drop across multiple systems. A conclusion. This is it, one instructor whispered. Not with relief, with certainty. The system had finally done what it was designed to do. The human was dead, or functionally equivalent. 6 seconds. There was nothing. No movement. No signal. No deviation. Just silence across the chamber. Then, the impossible happened. The flatline reversed. Not gradually, not as recovery, but as eruption. Vital signs surged back into existence with violent instability, as if the concept of failure itself had been rejected at the biological level. Neural activity spiked beyond measurable thresholds, then stabilized, not into normalcy, but into something structured, something intentional. This is not recovery, Selnari said slowly. I did not respond immediately, because I was watching the human's limbs. They were not responding, not at first. Muscle function indicators showed complete shutdown, total loss of coordinated motor activity. And yet, the body moved. A single arm dragged forward, then another. Not through biomechanical recovery, but through override, an instructor suggested weakly. No, I said, because I could see it now. This was not artificial assistance. It was internal. The human was forcing motion through neural command alone, bypassing damaged systems entirely, rerouting intent into action through pathways that should not have sustained continuity. Selnari leaned closer to her console. Pain integration still active, she murmured. I understood what she meant. The human was no longer reacting to pain. It was structuring itself around it, like a frame built around collapsing architecture. Below us, the body moved again, and again. Broken motion. Impossible persistence. This is not survival, I said quietly. The words felt heavier than any observation I had ever recorded. The chamber reacted, automatically, as if responding to an anomaly in its own logic. Escalation protocol triggered. I had not ordered it. No one had. But the system had recognized something we had not yet accepted. The subject was not failing. Therefore, the test must be insufficient. Gravity increased, not in increments, in a leap. The chamber bent under the new load parameters. Terrain deformed, atmospheric density warped in unstable gradients. The human collapsed instantly, or appeared to. For a moment, everything indicated final cessation. Then, it moved again. A twitch, then a pull, then forward momentum. Slow, unstable, but undeniable. The system escalated further. Pain fields intensified beyond previous thresholds. Neural disruption waves layered upon existing overload.
Oxygen deprivation reached levels that should have ended cognition entirely. Still, movement continued. This violates all predictive models, Selnari said. No, I replied, because I had stopped trusting models. The test adapted again. It was no longer following predefined phases. It was reacting, trying to force an outcome that refused to arrive. Maximum threshold breach, an instructor warned. I did not stop it. None of us did, because something deeper had taken hold in the room. Not curiosity, not observation, not even fear. Something more fundamental. The need to understand why it would not end. Below us, the human dragged itself across terrain that should have been insurmountable. Its form was no longer recognizable as functional. It was fragmented motion, reconstructed intent, a body held together not by biology, but by decision. That is not optimization, I said slowly. Selnari looked at me. I continued. The word changed the room, because it redefined everything we thought we understood. Optimization implies efficiency. Adaptation implies survival. Even resilience implies response to pressure. But refusal ignores the equation entirely. The test surged again. The system attempted to correct itself, to reassert control over a subject that was no longer responding to control. But each escalation only revealed more of the same truth. The human did not stop, not because it was enduring, but because it would not cease. Vital systems flickered again. Another collapse, another flatline, this time longer. 3 seconds, then reversal. Again, and again. Each time the body crossed a threshold that should have been final. Each time it returned, not restored, but persistent. This is impossible, Selnari said, but her voice no longer carried disbelief, only realization. Cavell finally spoke from the observation core, quietly, almost reverently. This is not survival, I repeated, then corrected myself. The escalation stopped making sense. Gravity no longer followed stable increments. Pain fields no longer adhered to defined maximums. Even the chamber itself began to lose coherence, recalibrating in response to a subject that refused categorization. The human was no longer completing the test. It was altering it, not through control, not through intelligence, but through persistence that rendered structure irrelevant. This is rewriting phase parameters, whispered Selnari. No, I said, because that would imply intent, structure, design. This was something simpler and far more dangerous. Silence fell across the observation deck, because that distinction mattered. Below us, the human moved again, barely, almost imperceptibly. But it moved, and the system, now destabilized in its own certainty, could no longer determine whether continuation was failure or success. Only that it was happening, and that it would not stop. For the first time since the test was created, a new classification appeared on the central display.
Not triggered by protocol, not assigned by logic, but generated by the system itself in response to something it could not categorize. The word pulsed, recalculated, remained. No outcome registered, Selnari said softly. I stared at the display, at the human, at the impossible persistence that refused to resolve into meaning. We have reached the breaking point, I said. A pause. And in that contradiction, the truth finally revealed itself. The test was designed to find limits. But what if the subject had none? Or worse, what if it simply refused to acknowledge them at all? Below us, the human continued to move. And for the first time in recorded coalition history, the system did not know how to end. There is a point in every observation where data stops being data, where measurement ceases to explain, where the mind is forced to confront something it was never designed to interpret.
we crossed that point without realizing it. It began with silence, not the silence of conclusion, but the silence of failure. The chamber, once a perfect instrument of controlled destruction, stopped responding to escalation commands. Systems that had functioned without deviation since its creation began to reject input, not through error, not through malfunction, through refusal. System integrity failing, Selnari reported, her voice unusually distant. I stared at the interface. No, I said slowly, because failure implies breakdown. This was something else. The system was disengaging, as if it could no longer reconcile input with outcome. The final escalation had triggered automatically. No one had authorized it. No one had stopped it. And yet, it did not matter anymore, because the chamber was no longer obeying intent. It was attempting to resolve contradiction, and failing. The display flickered once, twice. That should have meant the end. Instead, it meant arrival. Below us, the chamber doors opened. Emergency protocol. Medical retrieval units deployed instantly, flooding the broken environment with stabilization fields and recovery drones. Their purpose was simple: extract the subject, preserve what remained, and determine cause of failure. They were not prepared for what they found. The human was still there, on the ground, unmoving at first glance, a fractured form suspended between collapse and continuation, limbs bent at angles that should have made motion impossible, skin marked by stress patterns that indicated prolonged exposure beyond survivable thresholds. Every indicator we had ever trusted screamed the same conclusion. Nothing remained worth saving. And yet, it was conscious, barely, but undeniably so. One of the retrieval units paused. Subject cognition detected. It transmitted. That should not have been possible. Selnari leaned forward. I did not answer, because I was already watching the human's eyes. They were open, not wide, not alert, just present. A presence that should have been extinguished.
A presence that refused to disappear. Medical drones attempted stabilization, oxygen restoration, neural reinforcement, biological repair protocols initiated across multiple systems simultaneously. The human did not resist. It did not cooperate either. It simply existed through it, as if none of it mattered anymore, as if survival had already been decided and was no longer relevant. Then it moved. A small adjustment, a shift of weight that should not have been possible given structural damage. The retrieval units paused instantly. All external motion ceased. Every system focused on the anomaly. And the human spoke. It was not loud, not forceful, not even particularly clear, but it cut through every channel of observation with surgical simplicity. 3 words. No aggression, no pride, no challenge, just question. The kind of question that assumes continuation, that assumes expectation, that assumes the world has more to offer. Silence followed. Not procedural silence, not observational silence, something heavier, something absolute. I have witnessed thousands of first contact events. I have recorded the collapse of civilizations. I have observed species extinguish themselves in moments of realization. None of those silences compared to this one, because this was not the silence of ignorance, it was the silence of understanding. The medical drones froze, not physically, but operationally, as if the question itself had invalidated their function. Selnari's voice broke it first. But she was not responding to the human. She was echoing it, trying to comprehend its meaning. The human did not react. It simply waited, not impatiently, not expectantly, just waiting. And in that waiting, something shifted across the observation network, across every channel, across every linked system monitoring the event. The coalition began to understand, not all at once, not cleanly, but inevitably. This was not a failed subject, not a surviving anomaly, not even an exception. This was something entirely outside the framework of evaluation, because everything we had built, every test,
Every metric, every classification, was based on a single assumption that limits exist, and that all things eventually reach them. But the human had crossed every known threshold, not by surpassing them, but by continuing beyond them without acknowledgement. It did not optimize, it did not adapt, it did not refine itself into efficiency. It simply continued, even when everything said it should not, even when continuation no longer made sense, even when existence itself had become structurally impossible. And now, it was looking at us, waiting for what came next. That was when Cavell spoke. His voice came through the shared channel, low and controlled, but changed, irrevocably changed. A pause. Another pause. The retrieval units began to withdraw slightly, not by command, by instinct, as if proximity itself had become uncertain. The human's gaze shifted slightly.
Not tracking movement, not assessing threat, just acknowledging presence. Still waiting. Solnari finally spoke again. "This should not exist," she said quietly. No one contradicted her, because contradiction required alternative explanations, and we had none left. The chamber systems finally shut down entirely. Not from failure, but from completion of a process that no longer had defined parameters. The field stabilized into inert silence. No escalation. No correction. No continuation. Just end state. And in that end state, the truth settled fully across every observer. We had not been testing the human. We had been testing the concept of limits. And the human had answered that test without ever acknowledging it existed. Cavell activated the official record. His voice was steady now, but different, like something had been removed that could not be replaced. "Final classification," he said. A pause. Silence. No one objected, because no one could. And as I looked at the human, still broken, still barely alive, still waiting for something none of us could define, I understood the most important truth of all. The galaxy had not witnessed a victory. It had witnessed a revelation. And we were no longer the ones who understood the rules. After the test, there was no celebration, no conclusion, no sense of closure that typically follows an evaluation. Instead, there was silence across the coalition assembly, a silence far more uncomfortable than any failure report I had ever witnessed. We convened in the Central Accord Chamber, a structure designed to host every major species of the coalition simultaneously. Its geometry shifted subtly depending on the observer, adapting perception to ensure comfort, clarity, and control. But control was no longer something we possessed. Not fully. Not anymore. The first debate began before the formal record even activated. "This subject must be contained," one delegate argued immediately. "Their physiology is unstable, unpredictable. The results are not replicable." Another countered. That statement alone shifted the tone of the chamber. Because none of us did. The arguments fractured quickly after that. Some species demanded restriction protocols, limiting further interaction.
isolating humanity until proper evaluation frameworks could be developed. Others proposed deeper study, more invasive analysis, controlled replication attempts. All of it assumed the same underlying belief, that the phenomenon could be understood if examined correctly. But that assumption no longer felt secure, not after what we had witnessed. And then, a smaller voice entered the discussion. Quiet. Almost hesitant. This subject should learn from us. The chamber reacted instantly. Not with agreement, but with disruption. That idea. Learning from the subject of a failed test was not merely unconventional. It was destabilizing, because it inverted the hierarchy we had built ourselves upon. We were the observers, the classifiers.
The engineers of understanding. They were the subjects, or they had been. Now, even that distinction felt uncertain. Cavell stood at the center of the chamber when the debate reached its peak. He had not spoken since the event concluded, not once. His presence alone had changed, subtle at first, then undeniable. When he finally activated his recorder, the chamber fell into a reluctant silence, not commanded, earned. "I have reviewed all available data," he began. A pause. Assumptions. That word assumptions carried more weight than any statistic. He continued. The engineers of understanding had assumptions that were unchecked, unchallenged, untested. No one interrupted, not because they agreed, but because they needed to understand what he meant. "We defined strength as optimization," he continued, "as efficiency." He turned slightly, addressing no one species in particular. But there was an efficiency, a failure. A ripple moved through the chamber, not disagreement, uncertainty. Cavell brought up the simulation logs, not the metrics, not the performance graphs, but the failures. 12 of human endurance duration, he said quietly. A pause. The chamber was unclear. Another pause. The chamber was unclear. He let the statement settle, then continued. The human did not outperform us in efficiency. It did not surpass us in adaptation speed. He looked up, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that no one had ever associated with an instructor. A question. Witnessing a changing chamber. The chamber quieted further, because that phrase could not be categorized easily. Persistence beyond logic, not optimization, not adaptation, not even resilience in the traditional sense. Something older, something simpler, something absolute. Cavell continued. A long pause. In every system we design, there is a point at which continuation becomes inefficient, counterproductive. He gestured subtly. Silence held. Then Salnari spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "Selina?" Cavell nodded. He turned back toward the assembly. "Selina?" A pause. That sentence shifted the room, not emotionally, structurally, because it introduced a contradiction we could not easily resolve. Refusal was not a metric. It was not quantifiable. It was not scalable. And yet, it had outperformed every measurable system we possessed. A delegate from the Zytherian cluster spoke. "Refusal is not sustainable." Cavell answered immediately. "So does everything else." That response silenced further objection, because it reframed the entire discussion, not as superiority, but as endurance of a different category entirely. The coalition had always assumed a final boundary, a point beyond which failure was guaranteed, but the human had demonstrated something else. Not that the boundary was further away, but that it was irrelevant, because it was never acknowledged. Cavell dimmed the display. "We have been evaluating capability," he said. A pause. "We need to evaluate will." He looked across the chamber. Will. The word hung in the air, uncomfortable, unfamiliar, unclassified, because will was not something the coalition had ever needed to quantify. It was assumed to degrade alongside everything else.
But in the human, it had not. The debate did not continue.
not because it was resolved, but because it had reached the limits of language itself. There was nothing left to argue against, only something left to accept. Slowly, reluctantly, the realization settled across every species present. Not all strength could be measured in performance. Not all endurance could be defined by survival curves. Not all limits applied universally. And in that space beyond classification, humans stood alone. Not as the strongest, not as the fastest, not as the most efficient, but as something far more difficult to define, something that did not yield to failure, even when everything else did. Recovery should have been the end of observation. In most cases, it was. Once a subject stabilized, once systems confirmed survival, once metrics returned to baseline, the event would be archived, categorized, and sealed into the Coalition's ever-growing library of resolved anomalies. This case did not resolve. It lingered. Not in systems, in thought. The human survived. That alone was not remarkable anymore. We had stopped believing survival was the metric. What mattered was what came after. And what came after was unsettling. The recovery process took cycles, not because the technology was insufficient, but because the subject refused acceleration protocols beyond necessary thresholds. Every attempt to optimize healing was met with minimal response variance from the subject itself. There was no resistance, no cooperation, only acceptance of process. As if the body and mind were no longer in disagreement with existence, just continuing it, step by step, cell by cell, until eventually, it was whole, not perfect, not restored to prior state, but functional, conscious, alive in a way that could no longer be dismissed as incidental. That was when the inquiry began. We did not approach it as interrogation. That word felt inappropriate now. We approached it as understanding. Cavell led the session. He did not stand above the human. He did not impose hierarchy. He simply observed. The human sat in a recovery chamber designed for minimal stress environments. Soft gravity modulation, stabilized atmospheric composition, neural dampening fields reduced to near zero interference. It looked almost ordinary. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. Something that had survived what it survived, now sitting in quiet stillness. Cavell asked the question directly. The human blinked slowly. Once, twice. There was no hesitation, no calculation, no search for framing. It answered immediately. Silence. Not external, internal. Across every observer node linked to the chamber. The statement was recorded, played back, analyzed, reanalyzed, deconstructed into subcomponents of meaning, intent, and implied mechanism. Nothing emerged. No hidden technique, no biological anomaly, no cognitive restructuring pattern, just words. Simple, direct, unadorned.
One of the junior analysts attempted clarification. The human tilted its head slightly. A pause. Another pause. The distinction was immediate, and yet impossible to integrate, because the Coalition had built entire frameworks around the assumption that continuation required justification, that survival required reinforcement, that persistence was a function of optimization, reward systems, biological imperatives, evolutionary selection pressure. But the human was describing none of those. It was describing exclusion, not of pain, not of awareness, but of the concept of cessation itself. Cavell requested further explanation. The human frowned slightly, as if searching for words that did not exist in its vocabulary. I don't know how else to say it, it admitted. A pause. Silence followed again, heavier this time, because simplicity was not supposed to be this dangerous. One of the delegates finally spoke, voice restrained. The human looked at them, not challenging, not defensive, just honest. No embellishment, no philosophy, no hidden complexity, just continuity without interruption. The Coalition struggled with this more than any structural anomaly recorded in its history, because it violated the foundational expectation that behavior must be explainable through layered systems. But here, there were no layers.
only a decision that did not present itself as a decision. Cavell ended the inquiry shortly after, not because it was complete, but because it had reached a point beyond translation. Later, in private record entry, he classified the encounter, not as dare, not as observation, but as warning. A pause in the record. Another pause. The archival committee reviewed his report within hours. Debate was minimal, not because agreement was universal, but because opposition lacked grounding. If a species could continue without reference to stopping, then all systems designed to enforce stopping were irrelevant. Containment protocols were discussed, escalation thresholds recalculated, strategic models revised. But beneath all of it lay a quieter concern, one no one wanted to articulate openly, because articulation gave it form, and form made it real. Cavell submitted the final recommendation himself. It bypassed 3 layers of review due to urgency classification. The text was short, precise, uncomfortable. The committee flagged it for clarification. He added one final line. Not requested, not required, but decisive.